global awareness is crucial in identifying and addressing the roots of radicalism and extremism, promoting education, dialogue, and cooperation to prevent the spread of harmful ideologies. Global terrorism has been shaped by a range of actors with differing ideologies, goals, and methods. Among the most notorious figures and groups are Saddam Hussein, Osama bin Laden, and Hamas. Each played distinct roles in the geopolitical and terrorist landscape of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Understanding their connections, or lack thereof, helps clarify the complex network of global terrorism. This analysis explores their individual roles, ideologies, and any possible intersections in the context of global terrorism. Saddam Hussein, the dictator of Iraq. Saddam Hussein ruled Iraq from 1979 until 2003, when the U.S.-led coalition overthrew his regime during the Iraq War. His leadership was marked by brutal repression, military aggression, and widespread human rights abuses. He led a secular Ba'athist regime that prioritized Arab nationalism, state control, and authoritarian governance. While Saddam's regime committed acts of state terror against political opponents, ethnic minorities, notably the Kurds, and neighboring countries, e.g. Iran and Kuwait, there is limited credible evidence linking Saddam to global jihadist movements like al-Qaeda or Hamas. State terrorism versus global terrorism. Saddam's use of terror was primarily internal or regionally focused. He used chemical weapons against the Kurds in Halabja in 1988 and crushed Shiite uprisings in the south after the Gulf War. His invasion of Kuwait in 1990 led to the Gulf War, but was driven by territorial ambition rather than religious extremism. Relationship with Islamist groups. Saddam's secular Ba'athist ideology conflicted with Islamist movements like al-Qaeda and Hamas. He viewed radical Islamists as threats to his power. However, Saddam did offer some rhetorical support to Palestinian groups like Hamas, in the form of financial assistance to families of suicide bombers. But this was more a political maneuver to position himself as a champion of the Palestinian cause, rather than an ideological alignment. Myth of Saddam al-Qaeda. Link. In the lead-up to the 2003 Iraq War, the U.S. government, particularly the Bush administration, suggested connections between Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden's al-Qaeda. These claims were later debunked by U.S. intelligence agencies, which found no credible evidence linking Saddam to the 9/11 attacks or broader al-Qaeda operations. Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda, the face of global jihad. Osama bin Laden, a Saudi national, was the founder of al-Qaeda, the terrorist organization responsible for the September 11, 2001 attacks. Al-Qaeda's mission was to wage global jihad against the West, particularly the United States, and to establish Islamic governance based on a strict interpretation of Sharia law. Bin Laden's worldview was rooted in militant Salafism, which called for the violent overthrow of governments in the Muslim world that did not adhere to his version of Islam. His primary focus was on far enemy targets like the U.S. and its allies, whom he blamed for supporting apostate regimes in the Middle East. Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden. Despite both being prominent figures in the Middle East, Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden had fundamentally different ideologies and goals. Secularism versus Islamism. Saddam's secular nationalist Ba'athist ideology clashed with bin Laden's radical Islamist worldview. Saddam saw Islamist groups as potential threats to his authoritarian rule, while bin Laden viewed secular Arab leaders like Saddam as corrupt and illegitimate. Extensive investigations, including the 9/11 Commission report, concluded that there was no collaborative relationship between Saddam and al-Qaeda. While there were isolated contacts between Iraqi intelligence and al-Qaeda operatives, there was no evidence of a formal alliance or cooperation on terrorist attacks. Under bin Laden's leadership, al-Qaeda became synonymous with global terrorism. The group orchestrated bombings of U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania in 1998, the attack on the USS Cole in 2000, and the 9/11 attacks in 2001. Al-Qaeda inspired a network of affiliated jihadist groups worldwide, further cementing its role in global terror. Hamas, founded in 1987 during the First Intifada, is a Palestinian Sunni Islamist militant organization and political party. It emerged from the Muslim Brotherhood and seeks the establishment of an Islamic state in historic Palestine, opposing the existence of Israel. Hamas is designated as a terrorist organization by countries such as the United States, Israel, and the European Union, due to its use of suicide bombings, rocket attacks, and other forms of violence against civilians. However, some countries, including Russia and Turkey, do not designate it as such. And Hamas also operates as a political party, having won elections in Gaza. Hamas's ideology blends Palestinian nationalism with Islamist goals. It views armed struggle as a legitimate means of resistance against Israeli occupation. Unlike al-Qaeda, which focuses on global jihad, Hamas's activities are primarily localized to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The most significant factor separating Saddam Hussein, Osama bin Laden, and Hamas is their differing ideologies and objectives. Saddam provided financial support to Palestinian families affected by the conflict with Israel, including those linked to Hamas. However, this was largely symbolic and aimed at bolstering Saddam's image in the Arab world, rather than a sign of deep collaboration. As previously noted, investigations found no substantive links between Saddam Hussein's regime and al-Qaeda's terrorist activities. While both are Islamist groups, they operate in different spheres. Hamas is focused on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, whereas al-Qaeda pursues global jihad. Additionally, Hamas has condemned some of al-Qaeda's actions, particularly attacks against civilians outside the Middle East. In the aftermath of 9/11, the Bush administration sought to link Saddam Hussein to al-Qaeda to justify the invasion of Iraq. This narrative was critical in securing public and political support for the Iraq War. However, this connection was later debunked, and no weapons of mass destruction, WMDs, were found, undermining the primary justifications for the war. The impact on global terrorism. Ironically, the invasion of Iraq created a power vacuum that facilitated the rise of jihadist groups like al-Qaeda in Iraq, AQI, which later evolved into ISIS, Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. While Saddam Hussein had suppressed radical Islamist groups, his removal allowed these factions to flourish, destabilizing the region further. In summary, while Saddam Hussein, Osama bin Laden, and Hamas are often discussed within the broader context of Middle Eastern conflict and global terrorism, their connections are minimal and largely constructed through political narratives rather than factual alliances. Saddam Hussein was a secular authoritarian who used state terror for political control. Osama bin Laden led a global jihadist movement against the West, and Hamas is a Palestinian nationalist-Islamist group focused on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Understanding these distinctions is crucial to comprehending the complexities of terrorism and geopolitics in the modern era. Misrepresenting these actors as part of a unified front oversimplifies the diverse motivations and dynamics that shape global terrorism.